All right, it's now 10:02, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here this morning. We are here to present a webinar on current trends in youth substance use. To get started, my name is Jessica White. I'm a program manager of communities and schools with the Governor's Prevention Partnership. I joined the partnership in July of last year, 2021. And prior to that time, I spent time as a community school director and working in youth development programs for Boys and Girls Clubs and other various nonprofits throughout the state. So at the Governor's Prevention Partnership, we work to enhance the youth prevention and mentoring framework in Connecticut. We offer things like trainings, technical assistance, and collaborative approaches where we bring people together. We work to connect people, programs, and communities to the resources that they need to positively affect the lives of Connecticut's youth. So, our two major initiatives are doing substance use prevention work and then also building capacity and mentoring organizations as well. Always want to start by giving a huge thank you and acknowledging our funding partner here, who is DMIS, the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, whose generous support to us helps us to provide trainings like this at no cost. A little bit about our time together today. Our conversation will run for about 90 minutes. It should be less than that. We'll have plenty of time at the end for question and answers. However, I will keep my eye on the chat as we go through, so please feel free to put any questions or comments in the chat, and I'll take some time throughout to stop and answer them. And we will be recording this webinar and distributing the recording, as well as some additional tip sheets and other materials and resources to everybody who registers. So you can expect that email, in a week or so. So our agendas and objectives for today, we'll start by having some conversation about adolescents, talking about circumstances today that are important to their decision to use or not use substances, as well as developmental milestones that can impact their behavior and some of the decisions that young people are making. And then we will look at some data and some information about specific substances, some of the most common substances for young people to experiment or use today. Specifically, we'll focus on alcohol, cannabis, vaping, and then prescription pills. And then we'll end our conversation with some tips and strategies for talking to young people and having conversations about substance use. So to start us off, I would love to hear from you in the audience. If you want to just share in the chat, what do you think of when I say the word teens today? How would you describe teens? So think of a word or a phrase or thoughts that come to mind. Who are we thinking about? Compassionate. I love that one. Yes, this new generation is a very empathetic generation. I would agree with that. Social media, that's another huge one, right? Digital technologies and the way that they've transformed our whole world today. And teens are, one of the first generations whose entire lives are inundated with technology. I see fun, absolutely. You can't do anything with young people without having a fun element to it. Resourceful, easily influenced by social media. Absolutely. I agree with all of those thoughts. So thank you so much for sharing. I think we're all on the same page. Really, the time of adolescence is, starts around the onset of puberty and goes until somebody's about 20, 25 years old. Really, your mid-20s is when a lot of the adolescent development finishes. But we know that this is a huge period of growth and transformation. There's lots of physical development that's happening with puberty. People are growing into their adult bodies during adolescence. Adolescence is also a major time for identity development, where we have teens really asking, who am I? How do I fit into this world? What are the things that interest me? And, what are the things that I'm passionate about? All of those things, right? When you think that the trends and what's popular changes with the week, well, that's really true. And a lot of that is driven by this normal identity development, right? This natural questioning that's happening during that time. And then lastly, we also know that adolescence is a major time for brain development. It was largely thought that once you reached around 18 years old, that you're pretty much fully developed and that your brain is no longer growing. And today we know that that's really not true. That during adolescence, what your brain does is something called pruning. So it works to become much more efficient and better at what it does and how it processes things. So when you're a child, you're taking in all this information, your brain is constantly making new neural connections and it just has a lot of different information stored in there. But not all of that information is going to be necessary or useful going into adulthood. So the brain starts to prune away some of the neural connections that it doesn't really need anymore. And then it strengthens the ones, the skills and information that we use and access most frequently. So what this means is that, again, this is a really important time to make sure that we're taking care of our brain and not doing things like using substances during adolescence. A statistic that is shocking or just, a lot of people aren't aware of is that about 90% of addictions start in the teenage years. And it's really all of this growth and development, brain development has a lot to do with it. So adolescence is a really crucial time to make sure that young people are aware of what some of the consequences of substance use can be. In addition, it's really important, especially in today's society, when we talk about teens, that we talk about mental health. There has been a drastic increase in the last decade or two of rates of teen depression and anxiety, especially for young girls. So research tells us that 70% of teens in the United States say that anxiety and depression is a major problem among people their age. So even if it's not something that young people themselves are experiencing, they're very aware and encountering it through their peers and others that they're socially engaged with in that way. In Connecticut, 30% of teens, and this was in 2019 is where this data came from, so it's pre-pandemic, 30% of teens reported feeling sad or hopeless, which is our marker for depression. That's almost a third of our young people. And even more troubling is that females are twice as likely to report feeling sad or hopeless than males. And this is an unfortunate trend that we'll see throughout a lot of these statistics, that young females are experiencing feelings like anxiety and depression and also utilizing substances at slightly higher rates than the general population and certainly at higher rates than their male counterparts. So again, these are just important things. This is important context to be really aware of what's happening in the lives of our young people, that we're seeing rises in these types of internalizing behaviors. Really. So again, social media and digital technologies, we all know, have completely transformed our world, and that's true for young people as well. And I think it's really important to point out that, the story is not that more screen time or more technology is necessarily harmful or bad in some way. What research is really starting to show us now is that we need to have a more nuanced and complex understanding of how social media is impacting young people, right? If you think back to the recent Instagram leaks that happened, for example, in the fall last year, there was internal research data from Instagram that showed that I think it was around a third of young girls who use the platform report that they feel worse about themselves or worse about their bodies after engaging on Instagram and using the platform. That's very concerning. But if you flip that on the other side, that also means that 2/3 of our girls don't report that they have those negative feelings after engaging, right? So it really calls for us to think more about who are those young people that are having those negative experiences and negative outcomes, and how do we put additional supports and address it for them. But really the message is not that social media and digital technology in and of itself is bad. It's more, how do young people use it, and are they using it in an unhealthy way? With that said, there's definitely some risk factors for substance use that can be compounded online. Cyberbullying, for example, is one of them. We know that both perpetrators and victims of bullying have a higher likelihood of turning to substances and engaging in substance use. So really any way that bullying might be touching your life in person, and cyberbullying is included in that also, can have a profound effect on substance use. We know that cyberbullying has totally changed the dynamic of bullying as well, that it used to be, sort of relegated just to the school day, and then you can go home and find some peace and some reprieve from experiencing that bullying. But the way that the internet and social media works right now, there's no walls to it anymore. Cyberbullying and these types of interactions can happen anywhere. Kids can be in their bedroom, on their phones, or on their tablets, and still experiencing those kinds of interactions. So it's much more pervasive now than it was before we had the internet. Social comparison and peer norms are also a risk factor that can be compounded on the internet. So we mentioned the major identity development that happens during adolescence, right? So this is a normal and natural reaction for young people to be looking at others around them, looking at society, and comparing themselves. How do I fit in? And using all of those measurements and those kinds of sticks, as well as peer norms. So social media has really changed this, because now, again, kind of like cyberbullying, it's a real-time treasure trove of people's, their posts, their pictures, their reactions. Never until this time in history have we really had an inside view into the private lives of people that social media really provides to us. And that can be difficult for a lot of young people to navigate as well. So, and sort of related to that, we know that when young people are posting about substance use, alcohol is a great example. They tend to not really paint a complete picture or an accurate picture all the time. It's much like everything else on social media, is often a glamorized version of what's happening, right? They're showing how much fun it is to engage in alcohol consumption, but they're not showing, the embarrassing decisions that they made, or talking about the hangovers that they're experiencing the next day, things like that. So it's a very one-sided picture of what's going on. The other piece of this that social media and digital technology influences is alcohol advertising. That today, advertising is not as obvious as it used to be back in before there was social media platforms like this. It could be something like there's a huge rash of celebrities that have their own alcohol brands, right? So them doing product placements in just their regular feed. There's tons of them, but like Kendall Jenner is a great example. Just by following her Instagram, she owns a tequila brand, and she often shows herself drinking that tequila brand and has product placements on her feed. So again, that is a blurry line between just following a celebrity that you like or look up to, and being exposed to all of this advertising that normally young people would not be exposed to in that way. Much harder to have those barriers up. So the last piece about social media is how it creates new avenues of access. So I have some pictures up there of emojis that are often used to associate in text conversations to represent different drugs or different activities related to substance use. It's a good idea. There's some fluidity to these, so they change sometimes, but it's a good idea to just be familiar with some of the common associations. Like marijuana will be a broccoli or a leaf sometime. Those are common ones. Trees is another one. Your drug dealer would be your plug or your connect. So you'll often see like an outlet plug like that. Pills often have a pill like this, or there's a blue circle that is often associated with them. But really, social media has created new ways for young people to access not just drugs and substances, but also paraphernalia and other things associated with it. And they often work in conjunction with each other. So an example of how this might flow, you can think of TikTok as like the marketing platform. If you're not familiar with TikTok, the premise is that users post short videos that have text and music. There's often like dancing, and they're flashy and fun type of things like that. But you'll see drug dealers and other people posting the products and the things that they have available for sale on there. Then in the captions or somewhere in the post, they might put their Snapchat handle in there so that you can contact them on Snapchat, which is this next platform. If you're not familiar with Snapchat, The way that it works is it's a messaging platform. You can send text or videos, pictures. However, once the receiver opens them and looks at the message, it disappears after a few seconds, and there's no trace of the message after that. So it's a really good way to have hidden and discreet conversations that you don't want people to see afterwards. Right, so they might mark it on TikTok and make arrangements for the sale and make that connection on Snapchat, and then use a platform like Venmo or Cash App to be able to exchange the money and set up to make the sale that way. So it definitely has created a different dynamic than what used to exist in the past. You know, kids can really be sitting in their bedroom and still accessing things, substances and different drugs and paraphernalia this way also. Again, some people had joined a few minutes after we started, so if there's any questions or comments that you have, please feel free to jump them in the chat, and I'll keep my eye on there and talk about whatever you post in there. So now jumping into our current trends in youth substance use, and I'll start off with some promising and good news. There have been a decline in the rates of youth substance use that have been going on kind of since the 90s. There have been a gradual decrease. And then surprisingly, actually, in the year 2020 to 2021, we saw one of the largest decreases in youth substance use since 1975. So this data came from a survey that is given annually to students across the United States called Monitoring the Future. And you can see the rates of decrease that they see here. 10th graders, 11.7% decrease in illicit drug use. So this is really huge. It's important to note, of course, that this data was collected last school year, which was a complete anomaly of a school year. We had many districts operating in hybrid situations. Some youth were completely distance learning and not going to school in person at all last year. So it was a huge disruption to our normal routines and structures. We probably will hopefully never have those circumstances replicated again. However, we can still learn something from this, right? What were the factors that were most influential and most impactful in getting this decline to happen? Probably lack of peer pressure and social interactions among young people. We also saw a lot more adults who were working from home or spending more time at home if they weren't going to work every day in person, things like this. So it had a huge impact, we can tell. Another thing I thought was interesting that I just wanted to share about this, in reading some analysis of this data, they had found that they think the majority of this decline came from youth who delayed onset. So they found, or delayed initiation of use. So they found that teens who had said before the pandemic that they had already experimented or already tried drugs, that they had kind of continued using at pretty much the same rate. It was young people who hadn't yet initiated, who in the period where all of the pandemic restrictions were in place, they might have had their first experiences in that time if there wasn't such disruption to life, but they didn't. So in prevention, we say delay, delay, delay. That's always our message. The later you can delay young people experimenting or having their first experiences with any substance, really, the better their long-term outcomes are going to be. So, this is definitely really interesting stuff and things that we will continue to look for. We are very interested to see how this continues with data that was taken this year, for example, when we get the updates. And that information should be available sometime around the summer. So we're excited to see how these cohorts continue through time. All right, now we will jump into talking about alcohol. I see a question in the chat, somebody asking if this PowerPoint and the slides will be available for community presentations, and absolutely. We'll send out the recording of this, and we can also come and visit any setting that you would like to invite us to. We'll give small group presentations at schools. We can talk to businesses, faith groups. Absolutely. I'll give my contact information at the end, so please reach out. All right, so talking about alcohol and underage drinking now. So we're continuing to see some declines in the rates of underage drinking, which is really promising. But again, looking at this national data, by 12th grade, 55% of young people, so more than half of them, the majority, have used alcohol at least once, have consumed alcohol in the past year. So that's still a really high number that we would like to continue to see these rates decline. They have been declining, you can see, kind of since the 90s or so, but they are starting to level off a little bit. So it's really kind of a wait and see game at this point right now to see how the full pandemic effect, and as we're moving back into more normalized life, how these trends will continue and what we'll see from them there. So it's important to talk about some of the things that can influence underage drinking. And I would also now, with cannabis being legalized for adult use in Connecticut, I think these same considerations apply to cannabis as well. So some things that we think about are community norms. What are social expectations, and how is usage of alcohol or cannabis portrayed, right? Is it glamorized? Is it, you have to hold your liquor kind of thing, or is there more moderation and, messaging about having limitations and responsible use being presented to young people? Those are really important things, messages to be aware of. In addition to that, we think about media messages. So social media opens up a whole trove of information, right? Everything is available at your fingertips pretty much now. And we have streaming, all kinds of platforms and YouTube, things like that. So what are those media messages telling to our young people? What is being said in the songs that they're listening to, and the movies and the TV shows that they're watching? And it's not necessarily that they can't see any of those depictions, but being able to have somebody help them make sense of that, and to understand that, what's put in the movies or on TV is not usually a true depiction of life, right? It's glamorized, and it's not really what reality is like. In addition to that, we think about things like access and availability. When it comes to alcohol and prescription pills, this applies as well. The majority of young people report that they get it from their own homes or from the homes of their friends. So it's not that usually that they're going to a bar and being served, or they're walking into a package store and are able to purchase something themselves. So, do we have stuff that's readily available to our young people? Are we sort of monitoring what's there, or will you notice when things are gone? And also that our retail establishments, as I mentioned, that they are enforcing the laws that we have on the books, that they're carding people when they're coming to buy, or before they're serving them at a bar or a restaurant. And then the last piece would be policy and enforcement. So we have these rules, we have, ID laws, you have to be 21 to consume alcohol and cannabis. So is that being enforced? Do we have compliance checks that are happening from law enforcement, and other things like that? These are all important considerations, and sort of work together to create an environment that helps to keep you safe and help prevent substance use. So what do our rates of underage drinking look like right now in Connecticut? As I've said, they've been declining since the peak in the 90s. So we have pretty much halved our rate of underage drinking for the past 30 days as of 2019, which is really promising progress. We've also made considerable progress in some of the risky behaviors that are associated with underage drinking, such as binge drinking. This rate has also decreased here, and that youth who report riding with a driver who had been drinking alcohol from 38% in 1997 down to 14% in 2019. So again, that's promising, but we still have a quarter of our high school kids, right? 25% of our high school kids saying that they drank alcohol in the last 30 days. So there's still a lot of progress that can be made and some work to be done in these areas. I do want to point out, and I'm really proud of this, of our young people and the efforts that have happened in our state, that we see the rates of underage drinking in Connecticut are slightly lower than the national average. So 29% of youth across the country have reported drinking alcohol in the last 30 days, compared to 25% in Connecticut, and the same holds true of our risky binge behaviors and riding with an impaired driver. Oh, I see a question in the chat. Do you think rates have decreased because youth are vaping more weed than drinking now? Yes, that's a great question. We will talk about cannabis in a subsequent slide with this. And, this is really looking at overall rates of use, not looking at specific, um, substances in themselves. So that's kind of a hard question to answer, but you're absolutely right that it is trending. More and more young people are reporting that they are vaping cannabis instead of just smoking it. So I'm sure that that has some effect on there, but it would still capture that. They do still ask about them vaping, either the nicotine cartridges or the THC cartridges. So they differentiate there, but we'll talk about that in subsequent slides. So another troubling but important statistic to discuss is sometimes when we look at this data and break it down a little bit more to look at subgroups of people, we can see that there's variation in the rates of consumption. And some of these are troubling to us. So we said 25% of overall teens in Connecticut reported drinking alcohol in the past 30 days. But if we look at females, that jumps to 29%. And for youth who are in the LGBTQ community or identify as LGBTQ, that's 33% of them. So that is significantly higher than the general population. And the same holds true for binge drinking as well. So really what this speaks to is the need for us to come up with more targeted interventions and to understand what is the experience of our females and our LGBTQ youth that is making them turn to substances at higher rates. We know that, especially when it comes to LGBTQ youth, that they often face a lot of stigma and discrimination. It's a really difficult decision or, time to be able to share that information with your families. They sometimes face rejection and things like that, which can be a really difficult process for a lot of them. But again, it calls for the need for really targeted and customized interventions that we're looking at specific groups and understanding their experience and understanding what interventions would be effective in those specific cases. And again, some of the consequences that can come from underage alcohol consumption, they demonstrate higher rates of school absences and lower grades. Underage drinking is linked to physical and sexual violence and an increase of accidental injuries. We talked about the major brain development that happens during adolescence, which makes it a very troubling time to engage in substance use. And drinking alcohol is one of the things that can affect that brain development and have some lifelong effects. We also know that young people, again, because of that brain development, their prefrontal cortex is the part of their brain that is still developing. And the prefrontal cortex is responsible for things like making judgments and impulse control, so setting boundaries. And because that's not fully developed, their skills in those areas are not that strong. They're more prone to things like alcohol poisoning or to progress from using alcohol to experimenting with other substances as well. So now we'll jump into talking about cannabis. You'll see on your screen, there's a whole list of the common names that are often used for it. Marijuana is probably the most widely known, or weed is another one that it goes by a lot. We have some of the emojis that are shown here that are often used to represent cannabis, herb, broccoli, the deciduous tree, maple leaf, the four-leaf clover are just some examples. We also like to bring attention that we make a conscious decision as a partnership to refer to it as cannabis instead of marijuana. There is some, negative historical racist connotations that are connected to the word marijuana from, years ago when the first prohibition laws were being developed. So again, we try to go with cannabis, which is the scientific name for the plant that this comes from. So I'd like to hear from the audience a little bit on this one too. If you want to put in the chat, how do you think that legalization of adult use cannabis will impact our young people? So it's still not legal for them. You have to be 21 to purchase or to possess, but we still think it'll have some impact on them. So what do you think that that's going to be? I see easily accessible. Absolutely. There'll just be more of it around, right? You can go into a store and get it at this point. Or looking at this picture that's here, this is a shop window that is selling cannabis products. And you can see like there's a lot of candy and things that are very appealing to young people, like fun designs on all of this. I'm seeing it will impact the social norm regarding use. People bringing up that edibles, that those are a little scary. We're unsure about those. We'll talk about those too. Absolutely. So I think access and the social normalization are really the big consequences that we're concerned about with this for young people. We have some statistics too that show that there is the perception of harm associated with smoking is decreasing. So in 2015, people were asked, is there a great risk of harm from smoking cannabis once or twice a week? 36% said yes. And now 5 years later in 2020, that number dropped almost 10 percentage points down to 27% in 2020. So we know that lower perception of risk, right, is associated with higher rates of use. So this is certainly something that we're concerned about, that the wave of legalization and the path that cannabis took to get to legalization, right? It started with medical dispensaries where, you know, the idea and the perception that this is something that comes from your doctor, that it's medicine, right? That was the message that was being put forth at that time, and then progressed to now adult use being legal. But that perception still sticks, right? Where I think we have some work to do to just give education and information about what responsible use can look like for adults and what some of the negative consequences can be from underage use of cannabis. Thanks for your input, everybody. So what are some of the potential negative effects of cannabis use? Certainly an impact on brain development. Again, those neural connections that are being developed, we don't want substances coming in the way and impacting how those are formed. We also see impacts on things like learning, attention, and memory, as well as coordination and movement. So it's often thought that those were just short-term effects, that, you know, your attention and memory deficits, definitely the coordination and movement, but that your skills kind of come back after the high wears off. However, more research is showing that that's not really true, particularly for attention and memory. That studies were done showing 2 and 3 weeks after use that they were still able to record some cognitive deficits in attention and memory use from there. Another consequence can be lower quality of sleep. This I thought was a really interesting short-term consequence of it, that they find users who, when they sleep, that they spend less time at the REM stage of sleep. So, you know, we hit different levels of sleep throughout the night, from light sleep to REM sleep to deep sleep. And they're all important, but play different roles. In that REM sleep is when our brain is doing a lot of the repairing work from the day that just happened, where things that you learned and memories that you made that day are being solidified and, you know, filed away for future use. But if you're not getting to that REM stage, or if you're not spending enough time there, you might be sleeping, but you won't feel as refreshed the next day, right? Your body didn't have that time to rejuvenate that it needs during sleep. Additionally, cannabis use is linked to anxiety, depression, and suicide planning. A common misconception, or, you know, common thought about it is that it can be used in the short term to provide relief for anxiety and depression. However, research is showing that over the long term, cannabis use can actually affect your body's ability to regulate itself, and it can increase and make anxiety worse over the long term. Additionally, users of cannabis were shown to have lower GPAs and more skipping class. Thought it was interesting. They did a study on college students and compared alcohol users to cannabis users, and found that the negative outcomes related to academic success, like GPA and skipping class, were worse for cannabis users than they were for alcohol users. And then regular users of cannabis tend to report reduced life satisfaction overall compared to non-users. So a really important piece of this new cannabis legislation and how it's sort of showing up differently in our society than it had in the past is the THC potency that we're finding in the products that are available. So in the 1990s, the DEA reported that what they were taking off the streets had 4% or less THC potency generally. However, the flower that they were taking off the streets as of 2018 averaged more than 15%. And today, the products that are available in dispensaries and retail stores, 15% is often sort of like the bottom of the potency of what's available. It can go much higher for both flower, so just the regular bud that's shown here, but also concentrate forms, which I'll talk more about in a subsequent slide. But this is concerning because research shows that the people who do have the worst health outcomes from cannabis use, it's generally that they're using high potency products and they have frequent use. So there are consequences that come from having these really high potency products that people are consuming. And it's definitely something that we want to keep paying attention to. We were happy to see that in the Connecticut legislation, they did put limits on the THC potency that can be sold in retail stores in the state. So for flower, I believe it's 30% THC is the cap, and for concentrates, it's up to 60% is what the cap can be for those ones. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the forms of cannabis. Inhalation, so smoking it is by far the most common way for people to consume cannabis. So we're talking about joints, blunts, pipes, things like that. I like to point these out because there's a lot of really discrete products and things that you might not at first look know what it is you're looking at. But this is a highlighter that has a little pipe that just fits right in it. So this black little pipe will go right inside the highlighter case there. It's the type of thing that if you saw this in your child's backpack or in their bedroom, you probably at first glance wouldn't think twice about what you were looking at. And then these ones over here are flashlights that are working flashlights. You can screw them apart and then put them back together to be able to fashion them into a pipe that way. And these are available pretty easily. Some of this you can get right on Amazon for not too cheap, very expensive. There's lots of different forms of what that can look like too. And then to the question that was asked in the chat as well, vaping and using e-cigarettes to consume cannabis is another increasingly popular way for youth to be able to do this. It's not really clear where the rates of vaping are going. That going into the pandemic, they were kind of holding steady a little bit, not increasing, not decreasing, but we're not really sure how that's gonna change, with just now. We'll find out pretty soon though. But we do know that more and more teens are turning to vaping cannabis than they were previously. In just 7 years, from 2013 to 2020, there was about a 4-fold increase in the number of young people saying that they were vaping. Probably related to a lot of the perception around vaping in general, that it's safer than smoking, that it's not as damaging to you, which we will talk about those too in subsequent slides. And then edibles are another growing way, popular way to consume cannabis. Pretty much anything that you can put butter or oil in, you can infuse with THC, you can infuse with cannabis. So like candy, gummies are popular, baked goods, but really any kind of dish, you can do this. The things that we are concerned about with edibles are sort of two things. The first is serving size, especially if something is a homemade product. It's impossible to tell what the potency of it is. There's no way that you'd really be able to figure that out, right? Unless you have a lab or something, which most people don't. And even stuff that is packaged through retail stores and other things, the perceptions can still be off, right? So if you have, for example, a candy bar, typically a serving size of a cannabis candy bar would be just like 1 square of it. That's what you would eat. But especially for a young person, right, to sit and eat a Hershey's chocolate bar, just a regular chocolate bar, having one bar in a sitting is not a big deal, right? To eat an entire candy bar. But again, if it's a THC candy bar, that's probably not something that you want to do. Many young people aren't really aware of this, that you can easily overdose by just consuming too much, and eating an entire candy bar probably a good way to do that, unfortunately. The second thing, in addition to serving size, that we think about with this, or that is concerning about this, is the delayed onset of feeling the effects of it. So when you smoke, you can feel the effects almost immediately, right, within minutes. However, when you're eating edibles, it can take 30 minutes, sometimes up to 2 hours, for the full effects of the dosage to be able to set in. So some people don't realize this either, and they eat some and feel like it's not doing anything, that nothing is happening, and then they'll continue to consume more until potentially they consume too much, and then they overdose and have negative outcomes from it, a negative experience from it. So there's definitely a lot of education and talking to young people about these that I think should happen. And again, thinking about the perception of harm that we mentioned a few slides ago, I think this showing up in candy form is another contributor to that as well, that it's hard to think of candy, gummy worms, as something that is dangerous. But that is the case here, that these do carry some danger. So we'll play a little game if you're so inclined to. 4 of these gummies are THC infused, and 4 of them are just regular gummy bears. So it's either the right or the left. Does anybody want to take a guess at which ones they think are the THC gummies? You have a 50-50 shot. I see a vote for the right. Anybody else want to take a guess? Okay, another vote for the left. Somebody's saying they can't tell. Absolutely. It actually is the ones on the right. So if you guessed right, then you were correct. But the point being that it is very difficult to tell, and especially just by looking at them like this, you can't tell. It's not something that we could expect a child, for example, to know if they're encountering a gummy bear, for them to think, oh, I shouldn't eat this, it might be drugs instead of just candy. So really, this speaks to the need for, if there are adults in your household who are consuming cannabis, that they're taking measures and precautions to keep it out of the hands of young people, that it's not readily accessible to them, that it's put away somewhere, stored safely, locked away, where they're not able to just access it, or to even accidentally consume it if they're not aware of what it is. So the last form of cannabis consumption that we'll talk about, that's again growing in popularity, are cannabis concentrates. This is also called dabbing. These can come in a few different forms. I have some pictures of what it can look like, but it's called hash or honey oil. So that's like this one here. It's like smooth and sticky. Then wax or butter is another one. And then this would be called shatter. It's like a hard substance, like you could crack that right in half. So really what these are is they take the cannabis bud, the plant, and put it through a chemical process that dissolves away all of the plant material from it. And you're left with just this cannabis concentrate that has a really high THC potency to it. So the final product can have between a 40 and an 80% THC potency. And users report that they can have a high that lasts for up to 24 hours. I've heard reports that it can last even longer sometimes. So again, with the high levels of THC that are contained in these products, like these are one of the things that definitely need to be consumed with caution, if not at all, and is not something that certainly young people should be exposed to or be messing with. Oh, to go along with the concentrates, there is some paraphernalia that is often associated with them. So as I mentioned, the substances are kind of like sticky and gooey texture. So they often use these silicone containers to be able to store it in, that it won't stick to these. It comes right off of it easily. You can see there's like this little pick tool. It looks almost like a dentist tool or something that they would use to like manipulate and move the stuff around, get it to where they need it to go. This is an example of something called the dab rig. So one of the things about concentrates is that they have to be heated to a really high temperature to be able to combust or to vaporize really. So a regular lighter won't do it. You need to use a butane lighter to be able to use these. And you'll use a device like this, like you would put the substance in here, you would heat this up, it would vaporize and then go into this chamber here. Then that's the mouthpiece that people would inhale from. And they also have little kits like this is available on Amazon. I think it was about $35 and it would come with everything that you would need to be able to use a concentrate. It has the butane lighter, the silicone cases, the little tool here, and then this would be the device that you would smoke it out of. This would be the nail or the part that you would heat up with the lighter, have this come into contact with the concentrate, and then this fills with smoke, and this is where the user would inhale from there. So, again, these come in all kinds of like fun colors, like tie-dye that, have a pretty clear appeal to young people as well. So now jumping into vaping, which, we always think of alcohol as the most common substance. However, in 2019, with our statistics there, vaping edged out alcohol just slightly. I think the rates of use were about 27% for vaping, while only 25% for alcohol. So not too far, but still one of the most popular choices for young people. There's many names that this can go by, from e-cigarettes, hookahs, cloud pens. They can look all kinds of different ways. Sometimes they have fun designs on them. They can look very discreet. Sometimes they look just like USB chargers, right? It can, if you don't know what you're looking for, it can not be something that's very obvious. I used to have highlighters that looked like this, those little shapes there. So again, the rates of use for our young people, about 44% have said that they have ever used electronic vapor products. So, that's lifetime use. But about 27% say that they're current users, which means they have used in the last 30 days. Comparing that to the number who report that they currently smoke cigarettes, which is only 3.7%. It's so sad sometimes the progress that had been made against big tobacco and to make cigarettes something that young people and tobacco products weren't really interested in using anymore. And now with the advent of vapes, that there's been a big reversal to that. So some of the components that are found in a vape, they all have, the basic same components to them. There'll be some kind of battery device to power it, an atomizer, which is the thing that heats up the e-liquid and turns it into an aerosol. Then you'll have the cartridge that you put in there that stores the e-liquid, which may be nicotine solution most commonly, but as we mentioned, THC is also gaining in popularity. So sometimes they're THC cartridges that they use. And then this is where the mouthpiece goes. Some of the iterations of it, if I go back, like these tank versions you can put like regular flower from cannabis in there. It doesn't even have to be the concentrate part of it. So this I mentioned as well. So more about the trends with vaping. Juul for years was the most popular product that young people were using. That actually is not true anymore. And a lot of that is because of the lobbying efforts that have been done to curb the things about these products that appeal to young people. We know that they really like the flavored varieties, that they come in fruit and candy, mint flavored, things like that. Sometimes they'll give them like fun names like Captain Berry Crunch type of things, right, that have a lot of appeal to kids. 85% of young people who use e-cigarettes said that they use the flavored varieties and that the flavors were a major draw to them for using these products. So there's been a lot of effort to be able to ban or limit the availability of flavored tobacco products. The FDA did pass a partial ban last year, which we were very excited to see. So for example, Juul does not sell flavored tobacco products, or it's not supposed to anymore. However, there were loopholes in what they had passed. So Puff Bar is a great example. Puff Bars are a disposable e-cigarette. These have replaced the Juul as the most popular product that kids are using right now. And again, you can see the flavors that it comes in, like this one is OMG, which is orange mango guava, or lush ice, pineapple lemonade, just for some examples. Another one is called Smoke, which these have refillable pods. So again, the disposable e-cigarettes and the refillable pods were not included in the flavor bans that the FDA had passed. So these are loopholes that these products are still available. However, there are lots of efforts to be able to ban these as well, to help cut down on the appeal to young people. So again, there's a perception around vaping and the e-cigarettes that they are safer than traditional cigarettes. However, we know that that's really not true. Most of them contain nicotine, which is the addictive substance that is in regular cigarettes and other tobacco products, as well as a whole host of other carcinogens and chemicals, things like that, are all contained in those cartridges that they put in there. Many people believe or think, maybe because of advertising or who knows, that the purpose of e-cigarettes is to help people quit cigarettes or quit smoking tobacco products. However, the FDA has found that there's really no evidence that they are safe or effective in helping people quit. It's more just that they pick up a different habit instead. And in fact, they find that young people who use e-cigarettes are more likely to also smoke regular cigarettes or to eventually transition to using regular cigarettes. So there's definitely a little progression that happens there, but the perception that they're safe or that they can help people quit in some way is not really true. There's a lot of flaws with that logic. And then the last thing that I like to bring up about vaping that not everybody is aware of is even the word vaping, how we call it a vapor, is misleading. It's not a vapor that comes out of these devices or that people exhale when they are smoking them. A vapor would be like if you are boiling water, for example, and it goes from being a liquid to being a gas. It sort of just, once it becomes a gas, it dissipates into the air, and it sort of just kind of goes away. It changes form in that way. An aerosol, on the other hand, is different. An aerosol has stuff suspended in air. So I use the example of hairspray bottles, and I laugh back to when I was younger and I had bangs that I used to curl all the time, and then I would get them nice and crusty using a bunch of hairspray on them. But what would happen is I would spray the hairspray, and all of this hairspray, because it's an aerosol, would settle on the counter, right? And my mom would get mad because the counter would be all sticky from the hairspray being on there. But the point is, the hairspray didn't just go away. It didn't just dissipate in the air. It went in the air and then settled on all of the surfaces around it. And the same thing happens with these vapes when people are vaping. That's the nicotine, the diacetyl, all the other carcinogens and heavy metals that are contained in here, right? They don't just go away. They go into the air and then settle on all the surfaces around them. So it's very dangerous and misleading to call them vapors. All right, now for this last portion of talking about current trends, we're going to discuss prescription pill misuse. So we have a little game, you can see. On your screen are examples of counterfeit and real prescription pills. So if you want to take a guess in the chat and see if you can tell, is it the right that has the real pills or the counterfeit pills? Or is it the right or left that has the real pills? Which ones are the real pills? Anyone want to take a guess? All right, well, if you thought that it was the ones on the left that were real, then you were right. Those are the real prescription pills. The ones on the right are the counterfeit pills. But really the point is that just by looking at them, it's very difficult to tell which are the real pills and which ones are the counterfeit pills. That many of the sort of makeshift labs that these counterfeit pills are being made in. They use real pill presses, so it's very convincing with how they look. And most people are not able to tell just by looking at them if they have a real pill or a counterfeit pill. So really quick, we'll talk about the types of prescription pills that are most commonly abused. The first being depressants, also known as benzodiazepines. The common prescriptions for these are Xanax and Valium. Stimulants or amphetamines are another example. These are sometimes called like study drugs on college campuses, for example. People might misuse them because they think that it helps them study or focus more. Common prescriptions could be Adderall or Ritalin. And then the last class would be opioid pain pills, which are Oxycontin, Percocet, or Vicodin. The reason that we kind of bring this up is that there has been a huge influx of counterfeit pills that are being found in the illicit drug market right now. In 2021, the DEA has said that they confiscated more pills off the street in the US in that year than they did in the previous 2 years combined. And I think that trend is only continuing now. The market, a lot of these pills are being manufactured overseas and then brought here and sold on the illicit market. In terms of our Connecticut teens, about 10% of teens have said that they have ever misused a prescription pain medication, which just means using it in some way other than how a doctor prescribed it to you. Or if you took a friend's pill, something like that, that would count as misuse. But again, wanting to draw out attention to some of our other groups of people, seeing that LGBTQ teens report misusing prescription pills twice as much, 21% of them compared to 10% of the general population have reported misusing pills. Sometimes thought of as an escalation of substance use as well too. So that's certainly concerning that they're going to something that is perceived as somewhat of a harder drug to use. In addition, we know more and more teens are buying pills in particular off of the dark web and social media, using the platforms that I had talked about before to be able to make these connections and obtain these products. Here's some more of the emojis that are commonly associated with some of these. The P for Percocet. I'm not sure where the banana comes from or the bus either. But these are some of the ones to look out for. And again, another one of the reasons that these are so concerning is really there's a tainting of our illicit market that is happening right now. You may have heard of the overdose epidemic that's happening in our country, that we hit a very unfortunate milestone last year of over 100,000 people in our country dying from an accidental drug overdose. And in Connecticut, opioids were responsible for 93% of those, but fentanyl in particular being responsible for 85% of the overdose deaths in Connecticut in 2020. So the reason that this is happening is fentanyl is being added to a lot of the drugs that are available out there. I've heard law enforcement officers say that you really can't even buy heroin in Connecticut anymore, that it's all fentanyl that people are getting, that's what's available. So fentanyl is a synthetic opioid. So compared to like heroin and morphine, which are natural opioids, right? Those are derived directly from the poppy plant. Synthetic opioids are chemical compounds that are made in a lab. So same chemical composition, but they're not derived from the plant. Fentanyl is 50 times stronger than heroin, 100 times stronger than morphine. It's very inexpensive and it's very addictive, which is where the motivation for, cutting other drugs with it is coming from. So they're finding fentanyl in things that are not even opioids, right? So it's not just heroin. They also find like cocaine, for example, that's laced with fentanyl. The DEA, I mentioned the increase in the number of counterfeit pills that they took off the streets in 2021. And they estimated that about 40% of those pills had a lethal dose of fentanyl in it. And really that's because it takes a very teeny tiny amount of fentanyl to cause a lethal overdose. If the amount can fit on a pencil tip. So it's very different than a lot of the other drugs. It's much more potent. And it can also be injected, smoked, sniffed, sorted, or taken in pill form. So it can be taken in many, many different ways. So actually this week is National Prevention Week, and I learned that today is Fentanyl Awareness Day nationally, trying to bring more attention to this and make people more aware that this is out there. But it is really scary, you know, as we're seeing, for example, the number of people abusing pills is continuing to decrease from the peak that we reached in the opioid epidemic. We're still seeing more people dying, even though there's less users. And again, that's just because the supply, the product that they're taking is so deadly and so lethal right now. I've heard people say that we should really, instead of calling it an overdose epidemic, call it a poisoning epidemic, because you know, most people, it's just that they're not necessarily aware of what it is that they're taking. They think that they have something else, or they're taking, you know, their normal, their typical dosage, but it's a different product. It's a more potent product than what they were used to, and it has some bad consequences for them. So what can we do to help address prescription pill misuse among our young people? Well, one of the most effective things would be to monitor and securely store your prescriptions. Make sure that they're put somewhere, ideally in a lockbox, that, you know, not anybody can just access them, that you're watching how many pills are in there and that they're all accounted for. Additionally, that you safely dispose of unused medications. So opioids in particular, right, pain medications, they are not like antibiotics, for example, where antibiotics, you want to take everything that your doctor prescribed to you, finish the full course of the antibiotics. However, opioids really should only be taken as needed because of their high tendency for addiction. It takes very, very, even from prescriptions, you know, given by your doctor, opioids can be highly addictive. So if they're not needed to manage pain, then you don't have to finish the entire prescription and they should be safely disposed of. Some ways that you can do that, there's lots of drug take-back days that often police departments will put on. Most police departments have prescription drop boxes on their premises where you can go, no questions asked, just deposit your unused medications there and they'll take care of disposing of them. There's also products such as what's on your screen now called Deterra, which is a drug deactivation bag. So how this works is you open the bag, put your prescription in, there's you know, like some stuff in there. I'm not exactly sure what the solution is. You add water to it, it activates it, and it will dissolve the pills away, and then they can be safely put into the garbage from there. I've also heard of, you know, you can mix it with kitty litter, or somebody recently told me Dawn dish soap is something else. If you put the pills like in a bag with the dish soap, that they'll just gel and dissolve that way. And then you can put them in the garbage from there as well. Just don't put them down the toilet. That's all, because the prescriptions can end up in the waterways that way. And then lastly, we always like to talk about naloxone. Naloxone, sometimes known as Narcan. Narcan is the brand name of it. But this is the opioid overdose antidote. So this reverses an opioid overdose that somebody may have. Naloxone is available without a prescription from a pharmacy. Most insurance plans will also cover at least some of the costs for it. And it's a good idea if you know somebody that has opioid use disorder to just have this on hand, because it can save somebody's life, and it has many times. There's a big push now to make sure that we have naloxone available in all of our schools with some of the recent drug incidents that unfortunately have happened with our young people, so that our schools are quick to respond if there is a suspected opioid overdose. That's the other important thing to mention about this too, is that there's no negative consequences from giving naloxone, even if they did not have an opioid overdose. So really, if you suspect that even maybe that's what's happening, right, you should administer if it's available, because it won't be harmful if it wasn't an opioid overdose. And then we also have a website that was put together by the Department of Public Health in Connecticut. This is called norasaves.com, and you can go to this website. It's really simple, but has a lot of great information on it. It will tell you signs of an overdose, how to respond to an overdose, what are the steps you should do. It will tell you about where you can get naloxone, and also give you advice on what you should do after you administer naloxone. There is a place that you can go and report the administration, so the Department of Public Health can help keep track of where it's being administered. And then there's a really great website that is actually put together by a bunch of professional or prevention professionals in Connecticut, called YouThinkYouKnowCT.org. So this has great information for parents about, talking about where can kids get drugs, why do kids misuse drugs, talking about social media, and then options for treatment and support resources there too. So there's a lot of great information on that website. And then another one is called liveloud.org. This is for people who are struggling with opioid use disorder. And there's also a version of Live Loud Families too, for people who are supporting somebody experiencing opioid use disorder. Again, this has a lot of great resources and support on it. I encourage you to check it out. So this last few slides, we're just going to talk about some tips for having conversations with young people about substance use. It's a really important thing that you can do, and one of the most effective things that we can do to help to prevent substance use. We know that youth who learn about the risks of substances at home are up to 50% less likely to use them. So that's a pretty drastic cut in their likelihood of using substances, really just from establishing connections and having conversations in the home. So I know that having these conversations can be really intimidating and a difficult thing to do, but we still encourage you to make sure that you're talking about substance use with your young person. Our advice is to talk early and talk often. Right, the idea is that it's really never too early to start having these conversations. It might look a little bit different when they're children versus teenagers. However, sending the message that we have to be careful about what we're putting in our bodies, that we don't just take medicine from anybody, right? That we only take medicine from our parents or our caregivers, our doctors, people who are very trusted in that way. That's where the conversations can really start, and really also make sure that it's something that is in a frequent conversation, right? It's not a one and done type of thing. It's something that happens regularly. Go into the situation, asking questions. Really have the mindset of you're trying to figure out and understand what your young person knows about substances or what they think about substances. With, again, some of the recent incidents that happened a few months ago in our state involving fentanyl and other substances, many of them were middle school kids that happened with. So they were really young. Again, it's never too early to start having those conversations. But having a really curious mind and really just wanting to know what their thoughts are, what are their experiences, what have they seen before, and how did it make them feel when they were in those situations. And then lastly on this slide, just be really explicit and clear about how you feel about substance use, and be really clear about the decisions that you want your young person to make. Don't leave any gray area there in terms of the boundaries that you would like them to set, and what your feelings are. Next, the conversations can happen in bits and pieces. So again, this should be something that's happening over time, that this is a regular topic that we talk about. It's not a one and done type of thing. It also doesn't have to be a really formal and intimidating type of, we're going to sit down at the table and have an hour-long conversation. No, find those teachable moments, right? Like maybe you're watching a TV show or a movie and it's depicting some kind of drug use or other risky behavior. Use that as a moment to say hey, did you see that? Have you ever seen something like that in person? Did that happen at your school? asking questions like that can go a really long way, and just use what's out there in the environment. There's enough that's out there that I'm sure you'll find um, a lot of situations that you can speak to. Another really interesting thing that I heard from a young person recently that I want to share is they said that they really like to have difficult conversations with their parents in the car, because it's a little disarming to them, right? You don't have to make eye contact. You're kind of looking ahead, but it's still time that it can be an intimate conversation with just two people there. So think about environments like that too, right? Are there certain places like that just driving to school in the morning that you can make some kind of comment or ask a question in situations like that? And then lastly, a few more tips that we have are to find credible sources of information. So looking for at the Surgeon General, the CDC, the National Institute on Drugs, are great resources to be able to get more information about drug facts. Really, the scare tactics that had been used in previous generations aren't really shown to be that effective, right? The conversation has to be a little bit more complex than drugs are bad, don't do them. And our young people today, especially, really like to know that they're seeing credible information, right? They like science and evidence to back up and to validate the things that they're being told. Next, make sure that you're having really balanced conversations. So do things like make sure you talk about what motivates people to use substances, but also what motivates them to not use substances, right? There's like really strong arguments and things to think about on both sides of that. So having those nuanced conversations where you're talking about both sides of issues and, really hearing from what they think and what they have to say about it, and not sort of minimizing or pushing aside their thoughts about it, right? Validate them, like their experiences are important and meaningful to them. So use them to your advantage. And then lastly, even if you have used substances in the past, don't be afraid to speak up. It's ultimately about their future and not your past, especially if something like a substance use disorder, addiction, has impacted your family. It can be really difficult things to talk about, but having our young people have an understanding of those things and how they have affected their family, and them as individuals can be really powerful information. And don't underestimate what they know and what they've been exposed to, because chances are it's probably a lot more than we would think. Oops. All right, so 2 slides, just some resources. Again, I will send all these out to you so that you will have these. You can go and visit any of these websites to get more information about the stuff that we talked about. I also have an example. This is 10 tips for parents or caregivers on preventing youth substance use. This is one of the tip sheets that I will send out to you in the follow-up email to this conversation. You can see on the bottom, there are some conversation starters here. We also have this tip sheet available in Spanish, so I'll be sure to get both versions out to everybody. And then lastly, I want to do a plug. I had mentioned that it's National Prevention Week. So all week across the state, lots of local communities are doing different events and activities for families and young people. But on Saturday, May 14th, at the Discovery Center in Bridgeport, there is a big National Prevention Week event that's happening there. So there'll be lots of activities with like Gizmo, who is our mental health advocate dog in Connecticut. He has a book and fun activities. Gizmo will be there. There'll be coloring stations, the Change the Script van, lots of fun stuff for families. So I strongly encourage you to go and check it out. That's from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. on this Saturday. The Governor's Prevention Partnership will be there, so please find our table and come and say hello. All right, so lastly, I am going to launch a Zoom poll for us. If you could just answer a few questions on this poll, we'd really appreciate that. And lastly, I'm available for comments and questions. So please feel free to ask any questions. Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate your participation and for hearing what we have to share. So I will stay on for a while, but I do want to share my contact information with you as well. So please feel free to reach out. As I said before, we'll send a follow-up email, so you will have this recording and some additional resources with that. But in addition, this is a signature presentation that we have at the partnership that we're able to customize and deliver for a variety of settings. So if you would like to host us in your community, please reach out and let us know. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody. Happy National Prevention Week. Thanks for being here.